The morning of October 15th, 1936, arrived in New York with a peculiar copper light that only autumn in the city could produce. Our man, let us simply call him the Master, for that is what the neighbors on Delancey Street had taken to calling him, sat hunched over a Philco Cathedral radio, its Art Deco wooden shell opened like a patient on an operating table. The vacuum tubes glowed amber in the dim workshop, casting shadows that danced across shelves packed with resistors, capacitors, and mysterious brass components that most people would never recognize, much less understand. He was 42 that year, though his hands suggested both younger and older ages simultaneously, steady as a surgeon's when holding a soldering iron, yet marked with countless tiny scars from years of hot metal and sharp edges. Every tube has its own song, he would sometimes think, though he'd never say such a fanciful thing aloud. The 6A7 pentagrid converter before him hummed at precisely 455 kilohertz, exactly as it should. The shop itself occupied a narrow slice of a building that seemed to lean against its neighbors for support, as if the whole block had agreed to prop each other up through the Depression. 20 feet wide, 40 feet deep, with a ceiling that leaked during heavy rain, and windows that hadn't been properly cleaned since Coolidge was president. Yet within this cramped kingdom of electronic components and half-assembled machines, there existed a perfect order that only the Master could perceive. The bell above the door chimed, a small electronic device of his own creation that played a diminished seventh chord instead of a simple ring. Maria Kowalski entered, bringing with her the smell of October rain and fresh babka from the Polish bakery next door. At 19, she possessed that particular combination of uncertainty and determination that marked the children of immigrants who found themselves straddling two worlds. "You're late," the Master observed, without looking up from his work. He could identify people by their footsteps, the way their clothes rustled, the rhythm of their breathing. Maria's quick, light steps always carried a slight hesitation on the threshold, as if she were perpetually asking permission to exist in spaces. "Papa came home at 4 in the morning," she said quietly, setting down a paper bag on the cluttered counter. "Mama needed help getting him up the stairs." The Master's hands paused for just a moment above the circuit board. Stefan Kowalski had been a master carpenter in Warsaw, but in New York, he was just another man with calloused hands and too much time to spend in the taverns on Houston Street. The Master understood this particular transformation all too well. He'd seen it in too many mirrors during his first years in America. "The intermediate frequency transformer needs rewinding," he said, sliding a different radio across the workbench toward Maria. 455 kilohertz, remember? Count the turns carefully." She nodded and pulled up a stool, her young fingers already reaching for the thin copper wire. They worked in companionable silence for perhaps 20 minutes, the only sounds being the whisper of wire against wire and the distant rumble of the elevated train on Allen Street. The bell played its peculiar chord again. Mrs. Chen from the laundry 3 doors down entered, carrying something wrapped in brown paper. The Master had repaired her pressing iron twice, her electric fan 3 times, and had never charged her the full price. She was 45, with eyes that held stories she never told, and hands that worked 18 hours a day to send money to family members, whose faces she saw only in photographs. "Master," she began in her careful English, "I have unusual problem." He finally looked up, noting the worry lines around her eyes seemed deeper than usual. "Not the iron again?" No. Is about radio. My radio. It speaks to me in Mandarin at night. But I don't tune to Chinese station. I tune to WEAF for the music, you understand? But sometimes, very late, I hear voices speaking about ships and cargo. Speaking in code, I think. The master set down his soldering iron. Radio waves, like secrets, had a way of crossing boundaries they weren't supposed to cross. In 1936, the ether was full of signals, some intended, some accidental, and some decidedly clandestine. "Bring it tomorrow," he said. "I'll have a look." Mrs. Chen unwrapped her package, a silk dress with a tear along the seam.
"Also, perhaps you know someone who can fix?" "Leave it. Maria's mother is excellent with silk." After Mrs. Chen departed, Maria looked up from her wire counting. "Do you really think someone is broadcasting in code?" The master resumed his work on the Philco. "The atmosphere is like a great ocean above our heads. Radio waves travel through it like ships, sometimes arriving at ports they never intended to visit. During certain weather conditions, signals from thousands of miles away can bounce off the ionosphere and land in someone's living room in Manhattan. But code suggests intention. Indeed it does." He adjusted his jeweler's loop and examined a suspicious capacitor. "And intention suggests purpose. And purpose in this city usually suggests either money or desperation. Sometimes both." The morning aged into afternoon. Customers came and went. Mr. Goldstein brought a zenith that squealed like a wounded cat. Mrs. O'Brien's Crosley had simply given up the ghost after 10 years of faithful service. Each broken radio was a small mystery, a puzzle of electrons and resistance that the master approached with the patience of a detective and the precision of a mathematician. As the copper light began to fade toward evening, Maria finished rewinding the transformer. She held it up for inspection, and the master nodded his approval. "You're getting better. Your turns are more uniform now." "I've been thinking about what you said last week, about resonance, how every circuit has its natural frequency." "And?" "People are like that too, aren't they? We all vibrate at different frequencies. Sometimes we harmonize, sometimes we create interference patterns." The master almost smiled, a rare expression that merely involved a slight softening around his eyes. This girl understood more than just electronics. She understood the poetry hidden in the mathematics. "Your father vibrates at the frequency of vodka these days," he said gently. "But that wasn't always his resonant frequency. Sometimes circuits get detuned. Sometimes they can be adjusted back." Maria wrapped the repaired transformer in cloth, her movements careful and deliberate. "Sometimes they can't." "No, sometimes they can't." As she prepared to leave, pulling her thin coat tight against the October chill that had begun seeping through the workshop's old windows, she paused at the door. "Master, do you ever think about going back? To Poland?" He didn't answer immediately, his attention apparently focused on organizing resistors by their color-coded bands. "The Poland I left doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it never did. We carry these imaginary countries in our heads, perfect places that time can't touch. But real places change, just like circuits deteriorate. Capacitors dry out, resistors drift from their values, tubes lose their emission. You can't repair the past, Maria. You can only build something new from the components you have." After she left, the master sat alone in his workshop as the last light faded from the October sky. The vacuum tubes cast their warm glow across the cluttered workspace, and somewhere in the distance, a radio played Duke Ellington. He thought about frequencies and resonance, about signals traveling through the darkness, about all the voices crying out across the electromagnetic spectrum, hoping someone, somewhere, was listening. Tomorrow would bring new mysteries, broken machines waiting to sing again, and perhaps answers to questions not yet asked. But tonight, there was only the hum of 60-cycle current, the glow of heated filaments, and the peculiar peace that came from understanding how things worked, even when understanding why they broke remained forever elusive. The master reached for another radio, its silent circuits waiting for resurrection.
In the growing darkness of Delancey Street, surrounded by the chemical smell of flux and the comfortable chaos of his trade, he began again the ancient ritual of diagnosis and repair, one component at a time, one frequency at a time, one small mystery at a time. 5 days had passed since Mrs. Chen mentioned her mysterious Mandarin broadcasts, and the master had spent his evening hours monitoring various frequencies, searching for patterns in the electromagnetic chaos that blanketed Manhattan. October 20th dawned gray and miserable, the kind of day when the city seemed to huddle into itself, and even the pigeons looked dejected. The master was aligning an intermediate frequency transformer, a delicate process requiring absolute concentration, when the workshop door opened without triggering his musical bell. This alone made him look up. Someone had deliberately muted the chime, holding the clapper while entering. The man who stood in his shop was clearly uncomfortable being this far downtown, this far from whatever manicured world he typically inhabited. Thomas Brennan, 51 years old, carried himself with the peculiar dignity of senior domestic staff, neither servile nor superior, but occupying that strange middle ground of people who managed the intimate affairs of the wealthy. His black wool overcoat was impeccable, his shoes polished to mirror brightness despite the wet streets, and his Irish accent had been carefully sanded down to just a pleasant lilt. "You are the radio master of Delancey Street?" Brennan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I repair radios. My employer requires your particular expertise, a delicate matter requiring discretion." The master set down his tools with deliberate slowness. In his experience, when rich people said delicate, they meant potentially scandalous, and when they said discretion, they meant potentially dangerous. "I charge $3 for house calls above 14th Street. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore will pay $20 for your consultation today. Should you be able to accompany me immediately?" $20? More than a week's worth of typical repairs. The master noticed Maria watching from the corner where she'd been cataloging vacuum tubes. Her eyes were wide. $20 would pay her family's rent for a month. "Maria, you'll manage the shop." He was already reaching for his leather tool bag, checking its contents by touch. "If Mr. Goldstein returns for his zenith, tell him the oscillator coil needs another day." The Packard waiting outside seemed almost obscene on Delancey Street, its chrome gleaming among the push carts and shabby storefronts like a diamond in a coal bin. Brennan held the rear door open, and the master slid onto leather seats that probably cost more than his entire inventory. As they pulled away, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. A middle-aged man in a carefully mended wool suit, clutching a worn tool bag, looking exactly as out of place as he felt. The journey uptown was a lesson in urban archaeology. Each block revealed another stratum of New York society, from the tenements of the Lower East Side through the commercial chaos of Midtown, finally arriving at the limestone fortresses of Park Avenue. The master had made this journey before, but never in such comfort. Usually he took the subway, emerging like a mole into the blinding prosperity of the Upper East Side. "Mrs. Whitmore is a widow," Brennan offered, as they approached 72nd Street. "Her husband passed 2 years ago. She has been troubled by certain occurrences." "Electrical occurrences?" "One might say that." The building rose 15 stories, its Art Deco facade decorated with geometric patterns that seemed to pulse in the gray October light. The doorman, noting Brennan, didn't even glance at the master. He had become invisible, just another tradesman entering through the front door only because the service entrance was being repaired. The elevator, operated by a man who kept his eyes fixed on some middle distance, whisked them to the penthouse. The master's ears popped from the rapid ascent, and he worked his jaw to clear them, a gesture that made Brennan's mouth twitch in what might have been amusement or disdain. The apartment door opened onto a foyer larger than the master's entire shop. Black and white marble tiles created a dizzying geometric pattern, and a chandelier that belonged in an opera house cast prismatic light across walls covered in silk wallpaper. The master could hear it immediately, the 60-cycle hum of perfect electrical wiring, the whisper of forced air heating, the almost subliminal vibration of modern comfort. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore sat in what could only be called a drawing room, though the master suspected nobody had drawn anything there in decades. At 58, she maintained the kind of beauty that required constant, expensive maintenance. Silver hair arranged in perfect Marcel waves, a dress that whispered money with every fold, hands that had never washed a dish or scrubbed a floor. Yet her eyes, when she turned them on the master, held genuine distress. "Mr. Brennan says you're the best with radios," she began without preamble, "that you understand their peculiarities." The master's gaze had already found the radio, a Zenith Stratosphere, the 16-tube model that cost more than most people made in a year. It stood like an Art Deco altar against the far wall, its black dial face and chrome details catching the afternoon light, filtering through rain-spotted windows. "It's beautiful," he said, moving toward it with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching a shrine. 1935 model. 16 tubes, 3 bands, automatic volume control. The Ferrari of radios. It whispers to me," Mrs. Whitmore said flatly. "At night, even when it's unplugged." The master's hand paused above the cabinet. "What does it say?" "Threats. That I won't last the winter. That the cold will take me. Sometimes just my name over and over, like water dripping." She shuddered despite the room's warmth. "I had it examined by the Zenith dealer. They found nothing wrong." "May I?" At her nod, he opened his tool bag and began his examination. The chassis was pristine, the tubes all tested within normal parameters. No modifications, no additional wiring, no hidden speakers. He pulled the radio away from the wall, checking for any external connections. Nothing. "When did this begin?" 6 weeks ago, just after my nephew Charles visited. He's been
concerned about my welfare since his uncle died. The way she said concerned suggested anything but.
The master plugged in the radio, tuning across the bands. Perfect reception. No unusual interference patterns. He was about to declare the radio perfectly functional when something made him pause. There was an odd acoustic quality to the room, a subtle resonance he'd noticed in recording studios. "Mrs. Whitmore, might I examine the room more thoroughly? Sometimes the issue isn't the radio itself, but its environment." She waved permission, and he began walking the perimeter, running his fingers along the walls, listening. Near the corner where the radio stood, he detected it, a faint vibration in the wall itself. His fingers found the ornate brass heating grate, and understanding began to dawn like a slow sunrise. "Your heating system. It's steam?" Brennan answered from the doorway where he'd been hovering. "Original to the building, installed in 1902. The master knelt by the grate, peering into the darkness beyond. The brass pipe, visible inside, was easily 4 inches in diameter, a perfect acoustic conductor. "These pipes run through the entire building, from the boiler in the basement to every apartment," Brennan confirmed. The master stood, brushing dust from his knees. "I'll need to return at night to properly diagnose the phenomenon. Shall we say 11 o'clock? Mrs. Whitmore's relief was palpable. "You believe me then? You don't think I'm going mad?" "Madness is rarely so punctual, Mrs. Whitmore. Whatever you're hearing has a physical cause. I simply need to determine what that cause might be." As Brennan escorted him back to the elevator, the master noticed things he'd missed on arrival. A photograph of a younger man who shared Mrs. Whitmore's sharp cheekbones, probably the nephew Charles. A stack of legal documents on a side table with the words "competency hearing" visible. The way Brennan's jaw tightened when Mrs. Whitmore mentioned her nephew's concern. In the elevator down, Brennan handed him a $10 bill. "For your time today. The other 10 when you return tonight. I'll need to bring an assistant, my apprentice. She has excellent hearing." Brennan's eyebrow raised slightly. "A female apprentice. The electrons don't care about gender, Mr. Brennan." "Neither do I." Back in the Packard, heading downtown through streets now darkening toward evening, the master watched the city transform in reverse. From limestone to brick, from doormen to pushcarts, from possibility to survival. He thought about brass pipes carrying more than steam, about whispers in the dark, about the nephew whose photograph smiled too widely. When Brennan let him out on Delancey Street, Maria was still in the shop, 3 repaired radios lined up on the counter like soldiers. "How was Park Avenue?" she asked. "Full of pipes," he replied, setting down his bag. "Old brass pipes that sing in the night." "Tell me, Maria, what did you study about acoustic focusing in your physics reading?" Her eyes lit up with interest. "That parabolic surfaces can concentrate sound waves to a focal point. Why?" "Because tonight we're going to hunt whispers in a palace, and I have a feeling that someone has turned those old pipes into the most elaborate speaking tube in Manhattan." Maria closed the physics textbook she'd been reading. "Do you think it's deliberate? The whispers?" The master was already sketching a diagram of what he'd observed, his pencil moving across paper with quick, sure strokes. "In my experience, Maria, when rich people start hearing voices, it's rarely accidental. Someone wants something, and they're willing to torment an old woman to get it." He looked at the sketch.
pipes running vertical through floors, horizontal through walls, a network of brass that could carry sound as efficiently as wire carried electricity.
Somewhere in that building, someone was speaking into those pipes. And tonight, he would find out who. "Prepare your good dress," he told Maria. "The one your mother made for Easter. Tonight, you're going to see how the other half lives, and more importantly, how they scheme." October 25th arrived with the kind of bitter wind that found every gap in a coat, every crack in a window frame. The master stood in his workshop at 10:30 in the evening, watching Maria adjust the collar of her Easter dress. Navy blue wool that her mother had sewn from remnants bought on Orchard Street. She looked uncomfortable, older somehow, as if the dress carried responsibilities she wasn't ready for. "Remember," he said, checking his tool bag one final time, "you're there to listen. Your ears are younger than mine. You might catch frequencies I miss." They took the subway uptown, the late-night car populated by the city's nocturnal workers, janitors heading to office buildings, nurses changing shifts, a saxophone player with his instrument case held like a sleeping child. Maria sat very straight, her hands folded over a small notebook where she'd been writing acoustic equations all afternoon. At the building on Park Avenue, the night doorman examined them with the weary suspicion reserved for tradespeople arriving at unusual hours. Brennan met them in the lobby, his perfect composure intact despite the late hour. In the elevator, Maria's eyes widened at the operator in his uniform, at the polished brass controls, at the very idea that buildings could stretch so far into the sky. Mrs. Whitmore waited in the drawing room, wrapped in a quilted robe that probably cost more than the master's monthly rent. The magnificent zenith stratosphere stood silent, its tubes dark, the power cord conspicuously unplugged and coiled on the Persian rug beside it. "It usually begins around 2 in the morning," she said, her voice steadier than it had been that afternoon. "But sometimes earlier, always when I'm alone in this room." The master set down his bag and began a methodical examination of the space. He'd brought special equipment this time, a stethoscope he'd modified with a brass horn to amplify ambient sounds, a small mirror on a telescoping handle for examining hidden spaces, and most importantly, a bag of fine chalk dust he'd borrowed from a pool hall on Houston Street. "Maria, please sit where Mrs. Whitmore usually sits. I need to understand the acoustic properties from that position." While Maria settled into the silk-upholstered chair, the master began his investigation. He placed the stethoscope against various walls, listening to the building's hidden circulation, water moving through pipes, the distant mumble of elevators, the whisper of air through ducts. Near the heating grate, he heard it clearly. The brass pipes were humming, almost singing, with harmonics that shouldn't exist in a simple steam system. At precisely 1:47 in the morning, it began. The whisper came from nowhere and everywhere, a sibilant voice that seemed to emerge from the very air. "Eleanor, Eleanor, the winter comes for you." Maria gasped, her pencil freezing over her notebook. Mrs. Whitmore had gone pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. But the master was already moving, spreading chalk dust near the heating grate, watching how it swirled in invisible air currents. The whispers continued, sometimes clear, sometimes fading. "The cold will take you. You won't last." Won't last. The master held up his hand for silence.
then carefully positioned his modified stethoscope at different points along the wall. The sound was definitely traveling through the pipes, but with an unusual clarity that suggested more than simple acoustic transmission. He pulled out the small mirror, angling it to look up inside the heating grate. There, a modification so subtle he might have missed it in daylight. The pipe had been fitted with what appeared to be a brass cone, almost invisible against the matching metal, that would focus sound waves emerging from the pipe directly toward Mrs. Whitmore's usual chair. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, still examining the modification. "Who has access to these heating pipes?" "Why, everyone in the building, I suppose. They run through all the apartments." "But who has access to all of them? Who could install something without being questioned?" Brennan, standing in the doorway, shifted slightly.
The building engineer has a master key, and of course, the senior staff in each apartment. The master withdrew his mirror and stood, his knees protesting after kneeling on the hard floor. The whispers had stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. "Maria, please document exactly what you heard, every word." While she wrote, he traced his fingers along the baseboard, finding the pipe's path through the wall. These old buildings were like vertical cities, their infrastructure carrying not just heat and water, but potentially secrets, conversations, and now, it seemed, deliberately transmitted terror. "The radio is innocent," he announced. "It's merely standing near the true culprit. Someone has turned your heating system into an acoustic weapon, Mrs. Whitmore. The brass pipes carry sound from somewhere else in the building, likely the basement, where the main boiler connects all the pipes. The cone inside your grate focuses those sounds directly at your chair. But who would do such a thing?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice trembled with a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that she wasn't losing her mind, anger at being deliberately tormented. The master was already packing his tools, his mind calculating distances, angles, resonances. Someone who knows your habits. Someone who knows you sit in that particular chair late at night. Someone with access to both your apartment and the building's infrastructure. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Tell me about your nephew Charles. He visited 6 weeks ago, you said?" "Yes, he's been suggesting I consider moving somewhere smaller, more manageable. He's worried about my living alone in such a large space." She laughed bitterly. "He's particularly worried about my mental state. He even arranged for a competency hearing next month to determine if I'm fit to manage my own affairs." Maria looked up from her notebook, understanding dawning in her eyes. The master nodded slightly. She was learning that in the city, family could be the deadliest enemy of all. "I'll need to examine the basement," the master said, "to find where these whispers originate. But not tonight. Tonight, I need to think, to plan. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to create this illusion. They won't appreciate being exposed." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Whitmore touched his arm. "Can you stop it? The whispers?" "I can do better than that. I can reveal their source. But you must be prepared for what we might discover. In my experience, the truth often hurts more than mysterious whispers in the night." In the elevator down, Brennan was silent, but the master noticed how his hands clenched and unclenched, how his professional composure seemed to crack just slightly. The night doorman barely glanced at them as they exited onto Park Avenue, where the wind had grown even more bitter. On the subway ride back downtown, Maria finally spoke. The nephew wants her declared incompetent. If she can't manage her affairs, he manages them for her.
including her considerable fortune. The master watched the tunnel walls flash by in the darkness. But proving it is another matter. We know how, but not yet who is actually creating the whispers. The nephew might be behind it, but someone else is doing the actual whispering. Someone who knows the building, Maria added. Someone who could modify that pipe without being noticed. They emerged from the subway at Delancey Street just as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. The master unlocked his shop, the familiar smell of solder and dust welcoming them back to their own world. "Go home, get some sleep," he told Maria. "Tomorrow, I need you to research something for me."
Find out everything you can about acoustic focusing, about how sound travels through pipes. Check the library. Talk to that physics professor who comes for his radio repairs.
After she left, the master sat alone in his shop, sketching diagrams of the building's probable pipe configuration. Somewhere in that maze of brass, someone sat in the deep of night, whispering threats into the darkness, knowing those words would travel through metal and air to torment an old woman into madness. He thought about the nephew's photograph, the legal documents, Brennan's nervous hands. The pieces were there, like components of a circuit, waiting to be properly connected. But first, he needed to trace the signal to its source, to follow those brass pipes down into the building's bowels, where secrets bred in darkness. The morning sun painted Delancey Street gold, and somewhere a radio played the morning news.
The master picked up a broken Philco, its circuits waiting for diagnosis, but his mind remained in that penthouse, following whispers through brass pipes, hunting for the voice that spoke from the darkness. November 1st brought All Saints' Day, and a peculiar warmth that made the city feel unsettled, as if autumn had forgotten its duties. The master arrived at the Park Avenue building at 3 in the afternoon, carrying a different bag this time, one containing a pipe wrench, a measuring tape, and most importantly, a detailed map of the building's mechanical systems that Maria had somehow procured from the city's building department archives. The service entrance was operational now, and Brennan had insisted he use it. The master didn't mind. Service entrances often revealed more truth than marble lobbies. He descended concrete stairs that smelled of industrial cleaner and old cigarette smoke, following Brennan through a maze of basement corridors that connected the building's hidden circulation. "The boiler room," Brennan announced, pushing open a heavy steel door. The heat hit like a physical presence, and the master immediately understood why the building's engineer, a German named Kruger, wore only an undershirt despite November's arrival. The boiler itself was a magnificent beast from another age, riveted steel in brass fittings, pressure gauges like eyes, and a network of pipes spreading from it like the roots of some metallic tree. "You'll need something?" Kruger asked in accented English, not looking up from a pressure gauge he was adjusting. "Just examining the heating system. Mrs. Whitmore's complaint?" Kruger snorted. "Rich ladies always complaining. Too hot, too cold, too noisy." "Pipes are pipes." The master began his examination, tracing the 4-inch brass mains that rose through the building like spines. The original 1902 installation was beautiful in its functionality. Whoever designed it understood fluid dynamics and thermal expansion. But there were modifications, newer valves and junction boxes that didn't match the original brass patina. "Who maintains these pipes?" he asked, running his hand along a particularly large main that headed directly upward. "I do the boiler,"
Kruger replied. "But each apartment, they got their own people for the radiators and vents. That Irish fellow there," he nodded at Brennan, "he handles the penthouse." The master pulled out his map, comparing it to the reality before him. The pipe that served Mrs. Whitmore's drawing room was clearly marked. It ran from the boiler through a series of basement rooms before ascending.
He followed it, leaving the boiler room for a storage area filled with old furniture and forgotten trunks. Here, in the quiet, away from the boiler's rumble, he found what he was looking for. A small wooden platform had been constructed around one of the pipes, almost invisible among the stored items. On it sat a cushion, compressed from repeated use. The pipe at this point had been fitted with something extraordinary. A speaking tube connection, brass naturally, that had been welded so expertly it looked original. Brennan had followed him, and the master heard his sharp intake of breath. "Mary and Joseph," the butler whispered. The master examined the modification closely. Professional work, not some amateur's attempt. The angle of the speaking tube, the acoustic seal where it met the main pipe. Someone had understood exactly what they were creating. He noticed something else, a small notebook tucked behind the pipe, filled with practice phrases, times, and check marks. 2 a.m. to 2:15, he read aloud. "Eleanor, the cold comes. Repeat 3 times, wait 5 minutes, you won't last the winter. Repeat until she rises from chair." The handwriting was careful, educated, but deliberately disguised. The kind of writing someone might use when they knew evidence could be dangerous. But the master had repaired enough radios for enough customers to recognize certain patterns. The way the T's were crossed, the particular slant of the L's. "Mr. Brennan," he said quietly, still examining the notebook, "how long have you worked for Mrs. Whitmore?" 8 years come December." The butler's Irish accent had thickened with stress. "Since before Mr. Whitmore passed." "And her nephew Charles, how often does he visit?" "More frequently since his uncle died, once a month, perhaps twice." The master stood, his knees protesting from crouching. He walked slowly around the small platform, noting worn spots on the floor where someone had stood repeatedly. "Tell me, Mr. Brennan, what happens to the staff if Mrs. Whitmore is declared incompetent?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose we'd answer to whoever manages her affairs." "Her nephew?" "Most likely." The master picked up the cushion, noting how it had been shaped by repeated use, molded to someone's particular anatomy, someone who spent long periods here, speaking into the brass serpent that carried their poison upward through the building's bones. "Charles Whitmore has gambling debts," Brennan said suddenly, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "Owes money to some very unpleasant people. He came to me 6 weeks ago, said if his aunt was declared incompetent, he'd not only keep the staff on but increase our wages substantially." "And you said?" "I said I'd been loyal to the Whitmores for 8 years and wouldn't change now." Brennan's face had gone red, whether from the heat or emotion the master couldn't tell. "But someone on staff didn't say no." The master carefully photographed the setup with a small camera he'd brought, the flash powder briefly illuminating the basement like lightning. "Who else among the staff would know about these pipes? Who would have the skill to make these modifications?" "Thomas, the building engineer, but he barely speaks English. Margaret, the cook, but she's been with Mrs. Whitmore 20 years. And..." Brennan paused, clearly uncomfortable. "And?" "James, the night janitor. He worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard before the Depression. Knows metal work, knows pipes. His shift runs from midnight to 8 in the morning." The master consulted his notebook.
The whispers always came between 2 and 3 in the morning, when the building was quietest, when sound would travel most clearly through the pipes. A janitor would have freedom of movement then, could access the basement without suspicion. Where is James now? He doesn't come on until midnight.
Lives in a rooming house on 3rd Avenue. The master carefully replaced everything as he'd found it. The cushion, the notebook, even the dust patterns around the platform. We need him to perform again. One more time, with witnesses who matter. You want to catch him in the act? I want to catch them all in the act. James here, whispering his poison. Charles Whitmore, waiting for his aunt to break. And whoever else might be involved in this conspiracy to steal an old woman's sanity. They climbed back toward daylight, the basement's revelations weighing heavy as the heat. In the service corridor, the master paused. Mr. Brennan, I need you to do something that might go against your nature. I need you to pretend you know nothing. Can you do that? The butler straightened his tie, his professional mask sliding back into place. I've been in service for 30 years, sir. I can pretend many things. As the master emerged onto Park Avenue, the unseasonable warmth made the city feel feverish, diseased. He thought about the brass serpents hidden in the walls, carrying their venom through darkness, and about how greed could turn a building's very bones into weapons. He walked south, choosing to avoid the subway, needing the air and movement to think. At 59th Street, he stopped at a phone booth and dialed his shop. Maria answered on the second ring. I found it, he said without preamble. The whole mechanism. But we need witnesses, people with authority. Do you remember that judge who comes for radio repairs? Judge Patterson? The one with the Atwater Kent that wouldn't stop humming? That's him. Find his card in my desk. Tell him it's about Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore and a competency hearing. Tell him there's fraud involved. He'll listen. Should I mention the nephew? The master watched the traffic flow past, rivers of metal and purpose. Not yet. But Maria, be careful. If Charles Whitmore is desperate enough to do this, he's desperate enough to do worse. November 8th came wrapped in proper autumn cold, the kind that made the city's steam vents look like portals to a warmer world. The master stood outside the Stork Club on East 53rd Street at 9 in the evening, watching well-dressed couples disappear through its famous doors. He wasn't here for the champagne or the orchestra. He was following Charles Whitmore, who had entered 10 minutes earlier, looking nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm. The master had spent 3 days preparing for this surveillance, trading radio repairs for information among the network of doormen, elevator operators, and newsstand vendors who saw everything, but were seen by nobody. Charles Whitmore, 32 years old, stockbroker at a firm that barely survived the crash, lived beyond his means in a Murray Hill apartment and owed money to people who collected debts in blood when cash wasn't available. The service entrance to the Stork Club opened onto an alley that smelled of garbage and kitchen grease. The master slipped the busboy $5, 2 days' wages, for the loan of a white serving jacket. Inside, the heat and noise hit like a wall. The kitchen was controlled chaos, and nobody questioned another invisible servant carrying a tray of empty glasses. The main room sparkled with crystal and cigarette smoke. The orchestra played cheek to cheek, while couples danced on a floor polished to mirror brightness. But Charles Whitmore wasn't dancing. He sat in a corner booth with 3 men who definitely weren't stockbrokers. They had the thick necks and scarred knuckles of former bootleggers who'd found new employment now that Prohibition was just a bad memory.
The master moved closer, collecting glasses from nearby tables, becoming part of the room's circulation. His ears, trained to detect the slightest deviation in 60-cycle hum, picked up fragments of conversation. 20,000 by December 1st, one of the thick-necked men was saying. That was the agreement. Charles's voice carried the kind of desperate cheerfulness that fooled nobody. I'll have it. My aunt's competency hearing is November 29th. Once I'm managing her affairs, if she's declared incompetent. Big if, Charlie boy. She hears voices. Her own butler will testify to her deteriorating mental state. The judge will have no choice. The master moved to another table, his mind processing this information. So Brennan was supposed to testify? But Brennan had seemed genuinely distressed by the situation. Unless that too was performance. In this city, everyone performed for someone. He worked his way back toward the kitchen, but not before hearing Charles say, "The janitor's been perfect. Every night, just like we planned. She's already talking about moving to a sanitarium voluntarily. We might not even need the hearing." Outside, the master shed the serving jacket and walked east toward Hell's Kitchen, where the city showed its teeth after dark. Maria had discovered that James the janitor frequented a tavern on 9th Avenue, a place where Irish dock workers drank away their daily defeats. The master found him at the bar, a thin man with nervous hands and the permanent stoop of someone who'd spent too many years bending to clean up after others. The master ordered 2 whiskeys and slid one toward James. "Working nights must be thirsty work." James looked at him suspiciously. "Do I know you?" "You know my work. The brass modifications in the Whitmore building." Professional job. The janitor's face went white as paper. He started to rise, but the master's hand on his arm was firm. "I'm not a cop. I fix radios. But I know about pipes, about sound, about how voices carry through brass like prayers through a cathedral." "I don't know what you're talking about." $20,000. That's what Charles Whitmore owes to some very unpleasant men. How much is he paying you?" James's shoulders sagged. $500. When she's committed. $500 to destroy an old woman's sanity. That's about $16 per night of whispering. Is that what a conscience costs these days? The janitor drained his whiskey in one burning gulp. "You don't understand. My daughter, she's sick. Tuberculosis. The sanitarium costs $20 a week. $20 I don't have." The master signaled for 2 more whiskeys. Here it was, the arithmetic of desperation that made the city run. Everyone calculating what they'd sacrifice to survive another day, another week, another month. "There's another way. Help me expose this scheme, and Mrs. Whitmore might be grateful enough to help with your daughter's treatment." "Charles would kill me." "Charles won't be in a position to kill anyone once this comes out. But those men he owes money to, they might kill him." They drank in silence while the tavern filled with smoke and Irish songs. Finally, James spoke, his voice barely audible above the din. "It started 6 weeks ago. Charles knew about my daughter, knew I was desperate. He showed me the building plans, explained what he needed. Said the old lady was going crazy anyway, that we were just speeding up the natural process." "And you believed him?" "I needed to believe him. You ever watch your child dying by inches, mister?" "You'd believe anything that offered hope." The master pulled out a small notebook, identical to the one hidden in the basement. "Write down everything. Dates, times, what Charles told you, how much he promised to pay. Write it all down." "He'll know it was me." "He'll have bigger problems than you, trust me." James took the pencil with shaking fingers and began to write. His handwriting was careful, the script of someone who'd learned penmanship in Irish schools before everything went to hell. As he wrote, the master thought about chains of exploitation. Charles exploited by creditors, James exploited by Charles, Mrs. Whitmore exploited by them all. And somewhere, a child coughing blood in a charity ward, the ultimate victim of this cascade of greed and desperation. When James finished, the master took the notebook and left another $5 on the bar. Tomorrow night, whisper something different. Whisper, Charles owes $20,000 to Dutch Schultz's boys. Whisper it clearly, repeatedly. That's not what he told me to say. No, but it's what needs to be heard. Mrs. Whitmore deserves to know why she's being tortured. Walking back to Delancey Street through the cold November night, the master considered the mechanics of conspiracy. Like a faulty circuit, it only took one loose connection to make the whole thing fail. James was that loose connection now, guilt and whiskey corroding his resolve. In his shop, he found Maria still working, surrounded by books on acoustic engineering she'd borrowed from the library. "I found something interesting," she said without looking up. The specific frequency of human whispers, between 1 and 4 kilohertz, travels through brass pipes with almost no degradation. It's like the pipes were designed to carry secrets. They carry more than secrets.
They carry the weight of poverty, the sound of desperation. He showed her James's confession, watching her face change as she read. His daughter. That's why he did it. That's why anybody does anything in this city, for their children, their families, their futures. Even the worst actions come dressed as love. Maria set down the confession carefully, as if it might explode. What do we do now? Now, we prepare for a performance. November 29th, the competency hearing. But we're going to stage our own show first. One where the audience learns who's really whispering in the darkness. He looked at his workshop, at the radios waiting for repair, at the tools that could fix circuits but not human hearts. Tomorrow he'd return to Mrs. Whitmore with proof of the conspiracy. But tonight, he thought about James in that tavern, drowning his guilt in whiskey, and about a child in a sanitarium counting her breaths like rosary beads. The city never stopped calculating its exchanges. Money for dignity, health for wealth, sanity for survival. And somewhere in those calculations, people like the master tried to restore balance. One exposed lie at a time, one repaired connection at a time, knowing that tomorrow would bring new breaks in the circuit of human decency. The evening of November 15th descended on Manhattan with the first real snow of the season, fat flakes that turned to gray slush the moment they touched the streets. The master stood in Mrs. Whitmore's penthouse drawing room alongside Dr. Solomon Weiss, who at 67 moved with the careful precision of a man who understood that his body was a delicate instrument requiring constant calibration. Dr. Weiss had arrived carrying a leather case that looked like it belonged to a traveling salesman, but contained instruments more suited to a physics laboratory. Tuning forks of various frequencies, a mechanical stroboscope, and most remarkably, a container of fine lycopodium powder that would reveal air currents invisible to the naked eye. Acoustic architecture, Dr. Weiss mused in his Berlin-accented English, examining the room's dimensions with a practiced eye. The ancient Greeks understood it, built their amphitheaters to carry an actor's whisper to the back rows. But here, someone has created an amphitheater in reverse, focusing sound to a single point. Mrs. Whitmore sat in her usual chair, watching them work with a mixture of hope and resignation. She'd aged visibly in the past weeks,
her face drawn, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted her teacup. The whispers had changed recently, she'd reported. They now mentioned specific names, amounts of money, threats that seemed more concrete than supernatural. The master had spent the afternoon installing small chalk marks at precise intervals along the walls, creating a grid that would help them map the room's acoustic properties. Now, as Dr. Weiss activated his tuning forks one by one, those properties began to reveal themselves. "Listen," the old physicist said, striking a fork and holding it near the heating grate. The tone seemed to amplify, growing richer, fuller, as if the brass pipe were singing along. "The pipe is resonating at 256 hertz, middle C. But watch this." He sprinkled the lycopodium powder near the grate, and the fine particles swirled in patterns that looked almost deliberate, creating spirals and eddies that led directly to Mrs. Whitmore's chair. The master pulled out his notebook, sketching the patterns quickly before they dissipated. "The cone inside the grate," the master explained to Mrs. Whitmore. "It's not just focusing sound. It's creating what we call a standing wave pattern. The whispers ride these waves like a train on tracks, delivered precisely to where you sit." "Remarkable craftsmanship," Dr. Weiss admitted grudgingly. "Whoever did this understood both the physics and the psychology. The frequency range of whispers, it triggers our most primitive fears. In the camps during the Great War, we found that soldiers were more terrified by whispered commands in the dark than by shouted orders." They worked methodically through the room, documenting every acoustic anomaly. The master discovered that the walls themselves had been subtly modified. Small holes drilled behind picture frames created additional resonance points. The heavy curtains had been rehung at angles that would reflect sound toward the center of the room. Even the Persian rug had been positioned to absorb sounds from everywhere except the crucial path between grate and chair. "This took weeks of planning," the master said, measuring the angle of a particularly clever modification. "Someone studied this room, probably when you were out. They knew exactly where you sit, exactly when you'd be here alone." Maria arrived at 10 o'clock, having spent the day at the library researching legal precedents for competency hearings. She carried a folder thick with notes, but her expression suggested the news wasn't encouraging. "If Mrs. Whitmore's own butler testifies that she's been hearing voices," Maria reported, "and if there's no physical evidence of manipulation, the judge will likely rule in favor of the nephew's petition." "Then we need to create undeniable physical evidence," Dr. Weiss said, pulling out his most unusual instrument, a mechanical device that looked like a cross between a phonograph and a seismograph. "This records vibrations in the air, converts them to marks on paper. If we can capture the whispers and show their path through the pipes." They set up the device near the heating grate, its sensitive membrane positioned to catch any sound emerging from the brass depths. The paper roll was treated with a special chemical that would react to pressure, creating a permanent record of any acoustic event. At exactly 2 in the morning, the whispers began again. But this time they were different. Instead of vague threats, the voice spoke clearly. "Charles owes 20,000 to Schultz's men. They'll break his legs by December." Mrs. Whitmore gasped. The master kept his expression neutral, but he noticed Dr. Weiss raising an eyebrow. The recording device scratched away, its needle dancing across the paper in patterns that corresponded exactly to the whispered words. "That's not what it usually says," Mrs. Whitmore whispered, her eyes wide with confusion.
The master adjusted the device, ensuring it captured every word. The voice continued. Charles promised 500 to James. James needs it for his sick daughter. The sanitarium costs $20 a week. Now Mrs. Whitmore stood, her face flushing with anger rather than fear. Charles is behind this? My own nephew! Let the machine record everything, Dr. Weiss counseled. Evidence must be complete, undeniable. The whispers continued for another 10 minutes, a confession traveling through brass pipes, naming names, stating amounts, revealing the entire conspiracy in ghostly detail. When they finally stopped, the room felt different, as if a fever had broken. The master carefully removed the paper from the recording device, now covered with intricate patterns that translated sound into sight. This is your evidence, Mrs. Whitmore. These patterns can be matched to voice prints. Any competent acoustician can verify that these sounds traveled through the pipes, not through supernatural means. Dr. Weiss was already packing his instruments, but his movements were thoughtful. You know, in Berlin, before I left, we were studying how the Nazis used acoustic manipulation in their rallies, specific frequencies to create emotional responses, architectural modifications to make Hitler's voice seem to come from everywhere at once. The human ear is so easily fooled, but it's the heart that wants to be deceived. Mrs. Whitmore sat back in her chair, looking older but somehow stronger. Charles was my brother's only child. I wanted to believe he cared for me, not just my money. Family is the most effective disguise for greed, the master observed, carefully storing the acoustic evidence. We trust those who share our blood, even when they're draining it. Maria had been examining the brass grate with her young eyes, and she made a final discovery. Look, she said, pointing to tiny scratches on the brass. Someone's been adjusting this regularly. These marks are fresh, probably from last night. The master knelt beside her, seeing what she saw. Evidence of constant refinement, someone perfecting their terrible instrument, night after night. James was getting better at it. Practice makes perfect, even in cruelty. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Whitmore asked the question that had been hovering all night. What about James? What will happen to him? The master considered his answer carefully. He has a sick daughter. He made a terrible choice for a desperate reason. What happens to him is your decision, Mrs. Whitmore. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about understanding why good people do bad things. Dr. Weiss paused at the door, his old eyes holding decades of witnessed cruelty and kindness. In my experience, Mrs. Whitmore, the difference between victim and villain is often just circumstance. Your nephew had choices. James had only desperation. Perhaps remember that when you decide their fates. November 22nd arrived with a peculiar energy that precedes Thanksgiving, the city bristling with preparation and the forced anticipation of gratitude. The master entered the service area of Mrs. Whitmore's penthouse through the back stairs, carrying his tool bag with deliberate casualness. He'd been summoned to repair the kitchen radio, a convenience that felt too convenient to be coincidental. Brennan stood in the butler's pantry polishing silver with movements so automatic they seemed meditative. The small room was his domain. Neat rows of serving dishes, pressed linens, and in the corner, a desk where he managed the household accounts. The master noticed everything.
The locked drawer that wasn't fully closed, the corner of a letter visible beneath a ledger, the way Brennan's shoulders tensed at his arrival. "The kitchen radio," Brennan said without looking up from his polishing. "It's been cutting in and out. Cook is beside herself without her programs." The master found the radio, a small Emerson, on the kitchen counter. The cook, Margaret O'Brien, a sturdy woman of perhaps 60, was preparing advanced dishes for tomorrow's feast, her hands covered in flour, her face flushed from the oven's heat. "Blessed thing started acting up yesterday," she said, barely glancing at him. "Right in the middle of the romance of Helen Trent. 20 years I've been cooking for this family, and the one comfort I have is my stories." The master opened the radio's case, though he suspected nothing was wrong with it. This was theater, and everyone had their role. As he pretended to examine the tubes, he positioned himself to observe Brennan through the doorway. The butler had moved to his desk, was writing something with careful deliberation. "Mrs. O'Brien," the master said conversationally, "you must have seen many changes in this household over 20 years. "Oh, indeed." She kneaded dough with violent efficiency. "When old Mr. Whitmore was alive, this was a happy home. Dinner parties twice a week, musicians for the holidays. Now it's just her ladyship and the echoes." "And the nephew, Charles?" Her hands paused for just a moment. "That one started coming round more often after his uncle died, always needing something. Money for investments, he'd say. Investments in what, I'd like to know." The master had removed a perfectly functional tube, examining it against the light while actually watching Brennan in its reflection. The butler was copying something from one paper to another, his face tight with concentration or perhaps anxiety. "Tell me about James, the night janitor," the master said quietly. Margaret's voice dropped to match his. "Poor man. Daughter dying of consumption, wife already gone. Mr. Brennan recommended him for the job 6 months ago. Said we should help our own." She glanced toward the butler's pantry. "Mr. Brennan's got a good heart, even if he doesn't show it." The master replaced the tube and moved to adjust the radio's alignment, tasks that required him to shift position repeatedly, each movement giving him a different angle on Brennan's desk. On one pass, he saw it clearly. Correspondence with Charles Whitmore's letterhead, and beneath it what looked like drafts of testimony for the competency hearing. "There," he announced, turning the radio on. Helen Trent's melodramatic voice filled the kitchen, clear as spring water. "Just needed adjustment." He packed his tools slowly, then made his decision. "Mr. Brennan, might I speak with you privately?" The butler looked up, his professional mask perfect. "Of course. My pantry, perhaps?" Once inside the small room, the master closed the door and spoke without preamble. "I know about the testimony you're preparing for the competency hearing. I also know you told me you refused Charles's offer." Brennan's composure finally cracked, his shoulders sagging like a building settling into bad foundations. He walked to a cabinet, pulled out a bottle of Irish whiskey and 2 glasses, pouring without asking. "My sister," he said simply, "back in Cork. Her husband died in an industrial accident, left her with 5 children. I send money every month, but it's not enough. Charles promised an extra $1,000 if I testified that Mrs. Whitmore has been showing signs of dementia. But you haven't agreed to do it." Brennan laughed bitterly. "Look at those papers. 5 drafts I've written, and I can't finish any of them. Every time I try to write the lies Charles wants, my hand stops. 8 years that woman has treated me with more dignity than any employer I've known. She remembers my birthday, asks about my family, treats me like a human being rather than furniture that serves tea. The master sipped the whiskey, feeling its burn trace a path to his stomach. Yet Charles thinks you'll testify. Because I've let him think it. I needed to know how far this conspiracy went, who else was involved. Brennan pulled out a small notebook from the locked drawer. I've been documenting everything. Every visit from Charles, every strange occurrence, every time I found James in parts of the building where he had no business being. The master examined the notebook. Meticulous entries dating back 2 months, observations that revealed Brennan had been conducting his own investigation parallel to the master's. You knew about the pipes? I suspected something. I've managed households for 30 years. You learn the difference between genuine deterioration and manufactured madness. The whispers were too consistent, too calculated. And they always happened when I was conveniently elsewhere. Why didn't you report this? To whom? Charles has connections with half the judges in the city through his firm, and without proof. Brennan refilled their glasses. Besides, I needed to protect James. Fool that he is, he's just trying to save his daughter. In Cork we have a saying, the devil's best recruits are desperate fathers. The master turned to a particular entry in Brennan's notebook, dated November 8th. You followed Charles that night to the Stork Club. I saw you there too, in the borrowed serving jacket. A slight smile played at Brennan's lips. You're not as invisible as you think, master. But then, neither am I. We're both men who've learned to watch from the shadows. From the kitchen came the sound of Margaret singing along with her radio program, an Irish ballad that seemed to carry all the homesickness of every immigrant who'd ever crossed an ocean for a better life. The master thought about the layers of deception in this building. Charles deceiving his aunt. James deceiving himself that his actions were justified. Brennan deceiving Charles about his loyalty. And now this revelation that the butler had been playing his own deep game. The hearing is in 7 days, the master said. What will you do? Brennan walked to his desk, picked up the drafts of testimony, and very deliberately tore them into small pieces. I'll tell the truth, all of it. About Charles's debts, about the conspiracy, about those damned pipes. And I'll pay for my sister's family from my own savings, even if it leaves me with nothing. Mrs. Whitmore might surprise you with her gratitude. I don't want gratitude. I want to sleep at night without hearing those whispers in my conscience. The master stood to leave, but Brennan caught his arm. That evidence you recorded with the German professor, will it be enough? Combined with your testimony and James's confession, yes. Charles won't just lose the competency hearing. He'll face criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. And James? That depends on Mrs. Whitmore's mercy, and perhaps on your recommendation. Brennan considered this, then pulled out another piece of paper, writing quickly. A letter of recommendation for James, for a position at St. Vincent's Hospital in their maintenance department. My cousin runs it. The pay is less, but they have a program for employees' families with tuberculosis. His daughter would get treatment. The master took the letter, understanding the elegance of this solution. Justice served through mercy. Redemption offered through opportunity. You're a better man than you pretend to be, Mr. Brennan. We all are, master, or worse. Depends on the day and the circumstances. As the master left through the service stairs, he could hear the sounds of Thanksgiving preparation throughout the building. Pots clattering, Voices calling. The ordinary symphony of life continuing despite the conspiracies that threaded through it like poison through veins. Tomorrow, families would gather and pretend harmony, while grievances simmered beneath the surface. But in 7 days, one family's pretense would end, and the truth would echo through brass pipes that had carried too many lies. The morning of November 29th broke cold and clear, the kind of day when New York's skyline looked etched in crystal against a painfully blue sky. The competency hearing was scheduled for 2 o'clock in Mrs. Whitmore's penthouse. Charles had arranged for the proceedings to take place in her own home, believing familiar surroundings would make her deterioration more apparent to Judge Harrison Patterson.
The master arrived at noon with Maria and Dr. Weiss, but also with an unexpected addition, James the janitor, whose thin frame seemed to have collapsed further into itself, as if guilt had physically diminished him. They used the service elevator, Brennan meeting them with grim determination written across his features.
"Charles is already here," the butler reported quietly. "In the library with his lawyer, a Mr. Fitzgerald. They've been reviewing their strategy for the past hour. Charles seems very confident."
The master had spent 3 days preparing for this moment, creating what he thought of as an acoustic theater, a demonstration that would reveal the conspiracy in undeniable detail. In the drawing room, he'd installed hidden markers, barely visible chalk dots that would guide his presentation. The recording device from Dr. Weiss sat on a side table, its paper roll ready to capture whatever sounds emerged. Mrs. Whitmore sat in her usual chair, wearing a black dress that made her look both fragile and formidable. She'd aged years in the past weeks, but her eyes held a sharpness that suggested she understood exactly what was at stake. When she saw James, her expression flickered through anger, pity, and something that might have been understanding. "James," she said simply. The janitor couldn't meet her eyes. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. My girl, she's so sick, and Mr. Charles, he said—" "I know what he said." Her voice was steady, without mercy, but also without cruelty. "We'll discuss your situation after this is resolved." Judge Patterson arrived precisely at 2, a man in his 70s who moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd spent decades weighing evidence and finding most of it wanting. The master had repaired his radio twice, each time listening to the judge's careful analysis of what had gone wrong, appreciating a mind that sought truth in details. Charles Whitmore entered the drawing room with the confidence of someone who believed the game was already won. At 32, he had the kind of good looks that were just beginning to soften, privilege starting to show its costs around his eyes and jawline. His lawyer, Fitzgerald, carried a briefcase that probably contained affidavits about Mrs. Whitmore's supposed deterioration. "Aunt Eleanor," Charles said with practiced concern, kissing her cheek. She neither responded nor pulled away, sitting still as a portrait. Judge Patterson took his position behind a small desk that had been arranged for the proceeding. "This is an informal hearing to determine whether Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore requires assistance in managing her affairs. Mr. Charles Whitmore has petitioned for conservatorship, citing concerns about his aunt's mental state. Who speaks for Mrs. Whitmore?" "I speak for myself," she said clearly. "With evidence provided by these witnesses." Charles's confident expression wavered slightly. He hadn't expected resistance, had counted on his aunt's reported confusion to make her passive. "Aunt Eleanor, you don't need to put yourself through this. We're only trying to help." "Mr. Charles Whitmore," the judge interrupted, "you'll have your opportunity to present evidence."
Mrs. Whitmore, please proceed. The master stepped forward, his tool bag in hand. Your Honor, I'm a radio repair technician, called to investigate unusual sounds Mrs. Whitmore reported hearing at night. What I discovered was not malfunction, but deliberate fraud. He began his demonstration with the simple eloquence of someone who understood that truth needed no embellishment. First, he showed the modification to the heating grate, using a small mirror to reveal the brass cone that focused sound. Then, with Dr. Weiss's help, he demonstrated how sound traveled through the pipes, using tuning forks to show the resonance, lycopodium powder to reveal the acoustic paths. Charles had gone pale, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear, but the master was just beginning. If Your Honor would permit, I'd like to demonstrate exactly how this deception worked. He nodded to James, who looked like he might vomit from nerves. James, please go to the basement, to the exact spot where you've been sitting these past weeks. As James left, shuffling like a man heading to execution, the master continued. This conspiracy required 3 elements: mechanical modification, acoustic knowledge, and desperate people willing to traumatize an elderly woman for money. He pulled out the notebook James had hidden in the basement, showing the practice phrases, the schedule, the careful notation of what worked and what didn't. Then, he produced the acoustic recording from the night of November 15th, the scratched patterns on paper that captured the whispered confession about debts and payments. Your Honor, if you would sit in Mrs. Whitmore's chair, you'll experience exactly what she's endured for 6 weeks. Judge Patterson moved to the chair, his elderly frame settling into the cushions with visible relief from standing. A moment later, James's voice emerged from the heating grate, tinny but clear. This is James O'Malley. I'm speaking from the basement through the pipes. Charles Whitmore paid me to do this. I'm sorry. God forgive me. I'm so sorry. The judge's face hardened as he listened. Charles had stood up, his handsome face now ugly with rage. This is ridiculous. You can't prove— Sit down, Mr. Whitmore, the judge commanded with quiet authority that brooked no argument. Brennan stepped forward then, his testimony precise and damaging. He produced his notebook, the documentation of Charles's visits, his offers of bribes, his mounting desperation as December 1st approached, the date his gambling debts came due. I was asked to testify that Mrs. Whitmore showed signs of dementia, Brennan stated. I was offered $1,000 to lie. I refused, but I pretended to agree to learn the extent of this conspiracy. Dr. Weiss added his expertise, explaining in scientific terms how the acoustic manipulation worked, how it was designed specifically to create the impression of supernatural occurrence, targeting the psychological vulnerabilities of an elderly widow living alone. Charles's lawyer had stopped whispering, seeming to physically distance himself from his client. Charles himself looked trapped, his eyes darting between the door and the window as if calculating escape routes. Mr. Whitmore, Judge Patterson said, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Charles straightened his tie, attempting to recover his composure. These are misunderstandings. James acted alone, trying to extort money. I had nothing. Your signature is on 5 checks made out to James O'Malley, the master interrupted, producing copies Maria had obtained from the bank. Small amounts, but regular. Payment for services rendered. The room fell silent except for the tick of the mantel clock and the distant sound of traffic far below. Mrs. Whitmore hadn't moved throughout the demonstration, sitting with the stillness of someone who'd already made their peace with betrayal. Finally, she spoke. "Charles, your father was my favorite brother. When he died in the war, I promised to look after you. I paid for your education, introduced you to my husband's colleagues, gave you every opportunity."
And this is how you repay that love. Charles's composure finally shattered.
"Love? You call your condescension love? Always reminding me how grateful I should be, how much I owed you. I'm drowning in debt because I tried to live up to the standards you set, the life you said I deserved."
So you decided I deserved madness? The judge stood, having heard enough. Mrs. Whitmore is clearly competent to manage her own affairs. Mr. Charles Whitmore, you'll be facing criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. I recommend you find better counsel than Mr. Fitzgerald here. As the judge prepared to leave, he paused beside the master. That Atwater Kent you fixed last year still works perfectly. You do honest work in a dishonest world. Thank you for that. After the officials left, after Charles had been escorted out by Brennan, who took perhaps too much satisfaction in the task, the drawing room held only Mrs. Whitmore, the master, Maria, and James, who'd returned from the basement, looking like a ghost of himself. Mrs. Whitmore studied James for a long moment. "Your daughter, how is she?" "Dying, ma'am. Slowly but surely dying." She nodded, then looked at the master. "What would you do in my position?" The master considered the question, thinking of all the desperate choices he'd witnessed, all the ways poverty could corrupt good intentions. "I'd remember that justice without mercy is just revenge, and I'd remember that sometimes the best punishment is the opportunity for redemption." Mrs. Whitmore stood, walked to her desk, and wrote a check. "James, this is for your daughter's treatment at the Trudeau Sanatorium in Saranac Lake. It's the best facility for tuberculosis in the country. Brennan has also arranged a position for you at St. Vincent's Hospital." James fell to his knees, sobbing. It was an ugly sound, raw and painful, the noise of a man whose soul was being scraped clean. Mrs. Whitmore didn't comfort him, didn't absolve him, simply returned to her chair and waited for him to compose himself. "Thank you," he finally whispered. "Don't thank me. Thank the master here, who believes in second chances. And thank Mr. Brennan, who, despite everything, still thinks you're worth saving." December 5th arrived with the first serious blizzard of the season, snow falling so thick that Manhattan seemed wrapped in cotton wool, all sounds muffled except the scrape of shovels and the mournful horns of ships lost in the harbor. The master sat in Mrs. Whitmore's drawing room for what would be the last time, the zenith stratosphere between them like a silent witness to all that had transpired. Mrs. Whitmore had summoned him that morning with a different request. Not to fix something broken, but to explain something she couldn't understand. Charles had been arrested 3 days prior, released on bail posted by associates whose names the newspapers wouldn't print. The gambling debts to Dutch Schultz's former organization had been mysteriously forgiven, though Charles now owed a different kind of debt to people who collected in favors rather than blood. "He won't go to prison," she said, staring at the snow falling past her windows. "His lawyer negotiated a plea arrangement. 2 years probation, restitution to me that I don't want,
and mandatory employment at a firm in Chicago that specializes in rehabilitation of wayward sons of good families. The master understood the bitter arithmetic of justice for the wealthy. How money could transform criminality into mere indiscretion. How connections could commute sentences before they were even pronounced. Does that anger you? It exhausts me. She looked every one of her 58 years, perhaps more. I've dismissed Brennan, you know. The master's surprise must have shown because she continued quickly. Oh, not in disgrace, with a pension that will let him bring his sister's family to America.
He's taking a position with the Rockefellers. They value loyalty, and he's proven he has that in abundance. From his tool bag, the master pulled out a small Emerson radio, its wooden case polished to a warm glow. I thought you might like this. For your bedroom, perhaps. Sometimes it helps to hear other voices at night, ones that come invited. She accepted it with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. You never sent me a bill for your services. Some things shouldn't be reduced to dollars and cents. Spoken like someone who's never had too many dollars. But she was already writing a check, her fountain pen moving with decisive strokes. This is for your apprentice's education. Maria, isn't it? Brennan tells me she's been accepted to City College for engineering. The master looked at the amount and tried to hand it back. This is too much. It's exactly enough. I've also arranged for James's daughter to receive the best care at Trudeau. The girl's name is Catherine. Did you know that? 14 years old, wants to be a teacher. James writes me letters about her progress. Apparently the mountain air agrees with her. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow erase the city's sharp edges. The radiators clanged occasionally, steam moving through those brass pipes that had carried so much misery, now returned to their innocent purpose of bringing warmth. I'm selling this place, Mrs. Whitmore announced suddenly. Moving to a smaller apartment on Gramercy Park. 2 bedrooms, no servants' quarters, no elaborate heating system. Just rooms sized for a widow who's finally admitted she's alone. That sounds wise. Does it? Or does it sound like surrender? She stood, walking to the window where the city disappeared into white. My husband bought this penthouse as a monument to success. 15 rooms to prove we'd arrived, whoever we were trying to prove it to. Charles grew up visiting here, seeing all this waste, thinking it would someday be his. In a way, I created his desperation by creating his expectations. The master joined her at the window, both of them watching the snow fall on the invisible city below. We all create each other's expectations. It's the burden of living among humans. But Charles made his own choices. Did James make his own choices when poverty had him by the throat? Yes, the master said firmly. They were terrible choices from a terrible menu, but they were still choices. You chose to forgive him. That was also a choice. Maria arrived then, having struggled through the snow from downtown, her cheeks red with cold and exertion. She carried a folder of papers, the final documentation of the case, acoustic measurements, and testimony transcripts that would be filed away somewhere, evidence of a crime that would never truly be punished. Mrs. Chen asked me to give you this, Maria told the master, pulling out an envelope. Inside was a photograph, Mrs. Chen and her husband, reunited, standing in front of their laundry. The husband looked thin but alive, rescued from whatever horror had trapped him in China through those coded radio messages the master had chosen not to report. Mrs. Whitmore examined the photograph with interest. You knew about the coded broadcasts. I knew about many things, the master replied.
The city is full of secrets traveling through air and wire. Not all of them need to be exposed. How do you decide which ones to reveal and which to protect? He thought about it, this question that had no clean answer. I suppose I ask myself whether the secret causes harm or prevents it. Mrs. Chen's broadcasts saved a life. Charles's whispers tried to destroy one. Brennan appeared in the doorway, no longer in his butler's uniform, but in a simple suit that made him look younger, less burdened.
"The car is here for Mr. Charles's belongings, ma'am." They watched as boxes were carried out, the accumulated possessions of a nephew who'd visited often but never truly belonged here. Photographs, clothes, books, the props of a relationship that had been performance more than truth. "There's something else," Mrs. Whitmore said, returning to her desk. "I've established a fund at St. Vincent's Hospital for the families of workers who can't afford medical care. It will be administered anonymously. I don't want anyone's gratitude or anyone's resentment, just perhaps some other father won't have to whisper through pipes to save his daughter." The master packed his tools for the last time in this room, where he'd discovered so much about human nature's capacity for both cruelty and grace. The zenith stratosphere stood silent, its tubes cold, no longer suspected of supernatural malice. "Will you keep it?" he asked, nodding at the radio. "No, it's too beautiful for what it witnessed. I'm donating it to the Metropolitan Museum. Let it be admired for its craftsmanship, not remembered for its association with betrayal." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Whitmore handed the master one more thing, a small brass plate removed from the heating grate. A memento, to remember that sometimes the most elegant solutions hide the ugliest intentions. Outside, the snow had intensified, turning the city into an impressionist painting where all edges blurred and all sounds softened. The master and Maria stood under the building's awning, waiting for the storm to ease. "What did you learn from all this?" he asked his apprentice. Maria considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. That sound, like truth, always finds a way through. That poverty makes people desperate enough to become instruments of others' greed. And that mercy might be the most radical form of justice. "And what did you learn about radios?" She smiled, the snow catching on her eyelashes. "That they're innocent. It's the people who use them who carry guilt or grace." They walked into the storm, two figures disappearing into the white chaos of the city, carrying their tools and their knowledge back downtown where broken things waited for repair. Behind them, the building rose into the snow-filled sky, its brass pipes singing with steam, carrying warmth instead of whispers. In her penthouse, Mrs. Whitmore sat alone with her new Emerson radio, tuning it to WEAF, where Duke Ellington was playing something slow and melancholic. She thought about Charles, probably on a train to Chicago by now, running from debts both financial and moral. She thought about James, at his daughter's bedside in Saranac Lake, reading to her from books about faraway places neither of them might ever see. Mostly, though, she thought about the master, whose name she'd never learned, who'd appeared in her life to solve a mystery, and ended up revealing the deeper mystery of how people survive betrayal, not through justice or revenge, but through the careful, difficult work of choosing what to repair and what to release.
December 20th brought the kind of stillness that only comes when snow has been falling for hours, transforming Delancey Street into something almost unrecognizable. Clean, quiet, wrapped in white, like a gift waiting to be opened. The master sat in his workshop, the only light coming from the amber glow of vacuum tubes, and one small lamp bent over his workbench where he was aligning the most delicate part of a superheterodyne receiver. The Emerson radio from Mrs. Whitmore sat on a shelf behind him, playing Benny Goodman's orchestra so softly it seemed like memory rather than music. She had insisted he keep it after all, arriving by messenger that morning with a note, "For the one who hears what others miss." Maria worked at the other bench, her movements confident now as she rewound a voice coil, counting turns with the precision he'd taught her. She'd been accepted to City College's engineering program, would start in January, the first woman in her family to attend university. Her father hadn't had a drink in 3 weeks, a small miracle that Maria attributed to shame, but the master recognized as the peculiar hope that sometimes visited people when their children surpassed them. The bell above the door played its diminished 7th chord, and Dr. Weiss entered, stamping snow from his boots, carrying a paper bag that smelled of schnapps and fresh rye bread from Russ and Daughters. "The city is buried," he announced with satisfaction, as if he'd personally arranged the weather. "Even the criminals are taking the night off." He settled into the old chair the master kept for visitors, pulling out the schnapps and 3 small glasses he'd wrapped in newspaper. "For the cold," he said, pouring carefully, though the workshop was warm enough from the radiator and the heat generated by the electronics. "Any word from Mrs. Whitmore?" Weiss asked, settling the chessboard between them that lived permanently on a corner table. "She sent a card from Gramercy Park. Says the new apartment is small enough that she can hear every sound, know its source immediately. I think she finds that comforting." Maria looked up from her work. "And James? His daughter is improving. The mountain air, the treatment. She might actually survive. He writes to Mrs. Whitmore weekly, small reports of Catherine's progress. An odd penance, but perhaps necessary for both of them." They worked and played in companionable silence, the only sounds being the click of chess pieces, the whisper of wire being wound, and Goodman's clarinet weaving through moon glow on the radio. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the city's usual chaos until New York seemed like a different place entirely, somewhere kinder, more forgiving. Mrs. Chen appeared at the door, not entering, but gesturing for the master to come outside. In the snow-thick alley, her husband stood with 2 other men, all of them thin from their ordeals but alive, saved by those coded broadcasts that had traveled through the night air. "We leave for San Francisco tomorrow," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "My brother has a laundry there, a new start." She pressed something into the master's hand, a small jade radio tube carved with incredible delicacy. "From my grandfather's collection." He was a scholar, understood that knowledge travels in many forms.
"I can't accept this."
"You already have, by keeping our secret. Some frequencies are meant only for certain ears." After they left, disappearing into the snow like ghosts of gratitude, the master returned to find Maria and Weiss deep in discussion about wave propagation, how radio signals could bounce off the ionosphere and travel impossible distances, carrying voices across oceans, through storms, over mountains. "It's like the universe wants us to communicate," Maria was saying. "All these invisible highways in the air, just waiting for us to find the right frequency." Weiss nodded, moving his bishop with careful deliberation. "In Berlin, before I left, we were studying something called cavity resonance. Every space, every room, Every building has its own frequency, where sound achieves perfect clarity. The ancient Greeks knew this, built their theaters to amplify the human voice without any artificial assistance. The master thought about the brass pipes in Mrs. Whitmore's former penthouse, how they'd been perverted from their purpose of carrying warmth into instruments of psychological torture. But those same principles of acoustic science had also allowed him to expose the truth, to follow sound to its source. "Check," Weiss announced, his knight threatening the master's king. As the master studied the board, considering his options, the workshop door opened again. A young woman entered, carrying a Crosley radio that looked like it had survived the flood. Water-stained, one tube clearly blown, the dial face cracked. "It was my mother's," she said in accented English, Polish, from the same region the master had left 14 years ago. "She died last week. This radio was all she brought from the old country. Can you leave it?" the master said gently. "Come back in 3 days." After she left, Maria examined the ruined radio. "Can it really be fixed?" "Everything can be fixed, even if it's never quite the same as it was before. The circuits remember their purpose, even when the components fail. You just have to remind them, one connection at a time." Weiss finally won the chess game, as he usually did, his methodical approach overwhelming the master's intuitive play. As he prepared to leave, pulling on his coat and wrapping a scarf around his throat, he paused at the door. You know what I find remarkable? That boy Charles thought he could drive his aunt mad with whispers, but all he did was reveal his own madness. The brass pipes carried truth as efficiently as they carried lies. The universe, he said with a slight smile, has a sense of irony. After Weiss left, the master and Maria continued working as the snow fell and the radio played. She was repairing a transformer. He was cleaning corrosion from old contacts. Both of them engaged in the endless task of making broken things sing again. "Master," Maria said suddenly, "do you think we'll remember this? Years from now, when radios are different, when the city has changed, when we're different people?" He considered the question while adjusting a variable capacitor, feeling it click into proper alignment. "We'll remember the important parts. The sound of whispers through brass, the weight of secrets, the way mercy can be more powerful than justice. And we'll remember this: sitting in a warm workshop while snow erases the city, fixing what's broken, one circuit at a time." The Emerson radio shifted to the news, rumors of trouble in Europe, Roosevelt's latest program, the price of bread rising again. But in the workshop, surrounded by glowing tubes and the comfortable chaos of his trade, the master felt that peculiar peace that comes from understanding how things work, even when the why remains mysterious. He picked up the water-damaged Crosley, already seeing in his mind how to restore it, which capacitors would need replacing, how to rewind the damaged coil, where to find a replacement tube that would match the original specifications. It would never sound exactly as it did when it was new, but it would carry voices again, music again, stories again. Maria finished her repair and held up the transformer, perfect windings gleaming in the lamplight. "Another one saved," she said with satisfaction. "Another one saved," the master agreed, though he was thinking of more than just radios, of James's daughter breathing mountain air, of Mrs. Whitmore in her smaller apartment, learning to be alone without being lonely, of Brennan reuniting with his sister's family, of Charles, perhaps, learning in Chicago that some debts can't be paid with money. The snow kept falling. The tubes kept glowing. And somewhere in the electromagnetic spectrum, countless voices traveled through the darkness, hoping someone, somewhere, was listening. In his workshop on Delancey Street, the master was listening. Always listening. Understanding that every circuit completed, every connection restored, was a small victory against the entropy that threatened to silence everything. The winter silence wasn't really silent at all. It hummed with possibility, resonated with redemption, and whispered with the promise that even the most broken things could be made to sing again. If someone cared enough to trace the signal back to its source and repair what had been severed.